C'est bon? Très bien. Parfait. Écoutez, merci. Je suis Franck Lecoq, IPF et directeur du Centre international de recherche sur l'environnement et le développement. J'ai le plaisir d'être membre du jury et d'avoir été désigné président de ce jury par mes collègues. Pour la thèse de Miguel Rivière, intitulée Prospective Analysis in the Forest Sector when Facing Environmental Challenges, Insights from Large-Scale Bioeconomic Modeling. Donc c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici, donc avec l'ensemble du jury qui, crise sanitaire oblige, est pour l'essentiel à l'extérieur. Donc Valentin Delassène, directeur de recherche à l'INRA de Dijon, et rapporteur. Jean-Denis Mathias, directeur de recherche à l'INRA et Clermont-Ferrand, donc rapporteur lui aussi. Madame Catherine Skolce, professeure associée à l'université de Inland Norway, examinatrice. Myriam Fournier, donc directrice à l'INRA Nancy, examinatrice aussi. Vos deux directeurs de thèse, donc Philippe Delacote et Sylvain Corlat, et moi-même. Donc dans l'ordre des choses, vous allez nous présenter un résumé de vos travaux en 45 minutes. Ce sera suivi ensuite par des échanges avec les membres du jury. D'abord vos deux rapporteurs, dans l'ordre Valentin Delassène et Jean-Denis Mathias, et puis ensuite les trois examinateurs, et enfin vos deux directeurs de thèse. Voilà, on verra la façon de s'organiser pour les questions-réponses en temps et en heure. Mais d'ici là, je vous propose de commencer votre présentation. Et je propose aussi à mes collègues qui sont en visio de couper leur micro, de telle sorte qu'on évite les interférences.
Okay, so you should be able to see my screen. Can you just confirm?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, let's start then. So hello everyone, thank you for coming today to my PhD defense, which is entitled Prospective Analysis in the Forest Sector when Facing Environmental Challenges, Insights from Large-Scale Bioeconomic Modeling. Before we start, I'd like to thank my two supervisors, Philippe and Sylvain from Beta, as well as the jury who kindly accepted to review and discuss my work. So this jury comprises international members, so this presentation will be held in English, and the subsequent discussions in either French or English. So let's begin. As we all know, the last decades have been characterized by a strong increase in environmental concerns, with many issues at stake, and especially climate change being at the forefront. If we take the specific example of climate change, we can say that the forest sector and forestry occupy a particular space, because on the one hand, forestry can help mitigate climate change through carbon sequestration or substitution effects, but on the other hand, it is expected that climate change will also affect the forest sector through dynamics such as the migration of species or the intensification of drought events. These many relationships between the forest sector and global changes are increasingly recognized in policy frameworks. If we take the specific example of France, we can cite, for instance, the National Forest and Wood Programme or the National Low Carbon Strategy, and both documents state the importance of managing forests to mitigate climate change, to protect biodiversity, but also they acknowledge the need to adapt current practices in anticipation of the expected climate impacts, while reminding that we must find a balance with timber production, economic and industrial activities. These policies usually rely on the definition of goals and of scenarios to reach these goals, and then they can turn to science to assess their feasibility and also their implications. In the case of complex systems such as the forest sector, science can turn to modeling as a method of inquiry, and we can see models as being representations of a target system in the real world about which we want to gain understanding by studying the model rather than studying the real world itself. In the case of the forest sector, This target can be apprehended at different spatial scales, which range from a single tree to the global timber industry, but also through the lens of different disciplines, which could be ecology, biology, economics, or political sciences. In this thesis, I focus on one particular type of models called forest sector models, FSMs for short, which are computer-based large-scale bioeconomic models of the forest sector. And in particular, I am interested in their contribution to forest policy in an age where environmental concerns are at the forefront. Forest sector models seek to represent two things. On the one hand, forest resources and how they evolve over time, and on the other hand, timber industries and timber markets, as well as interactions between these two elements. And as a result, they can be seen as an attempt to bridge the gap between large-scale ecological modeling, and economic market modeling and activity analysis on the other hand. These types of models were originally created in the late 70s to explore future developments in the use of resources and timber supply, and they've been used to perform a variety of assessment reports, such as the RPA assessment in the US or the EFSO studies in Europe. As we've seen, there has been a shift in policy over the last decades away from purely timber-centric issues towards wider environmental questions. So one can wonder whether a similar shift has also happened in forest sector modeling. We have some evidence that it is the case, with many articles in Science published on the topics of bioenergy or biodiversity. But even though that might be the case, one can still wonder whether the models are used to address truly policy-relevant questions or only those that are technically feasible. And this is the general question that I investigate in this thesis. So it's the following. To what extent can forest sector models, FSMs, accompany forest policy in facing current environmental challenges and in particular climate change? My work comprises two main sections. In the first section, I adopt an outsider's perspective around the models, and I focus on the relationship between models and policy. In chapter 1, I try to highlight different determinants of modeling practices, and in chapter 2, I try to assess the extent to which objectives other than the production and trade of timber have been introduced in forest sector modeling research and how. In both cases, methods include literature reviews, bibliometrics, and also elements of history and epistemology. In the second section, I adopt an insider's perspective and I use models to perform applied study cases, with each time a policy objective and a methodological objective, which appear in orange. In chapter 3, I assess the implications for the French forest sector of management activities that seek to both produce timber and store carbon. And in chapter 4, I assess the implications of climate-induced changes in wildfire regimes. Together, these two chapters address two different facets of climate change, which are mitigation and adaptation. From a methodological perspective, I seek to implement three solutions to a deeper integration of environmental questions in forest sector models. The first one is the consideration of local environmental conditions and how they vary across space. The second one is the establishment of model couplings, meaning several models being used together to expand the range of possible analysis. And the third one is the introduction of a probabilistic component into a deterministic model to introduce and propagate uncertainty. These two applied study cases focus both on the French forest sector. In the end, we can say that my work focuses on the real world just as much as it focuses on the world within the models. So we're now going to move on to chapter 1, where I focus on the relationship between modeling, policy, and other determinants. So as I said in the introduction, models can be seen as representations of a target system in the real world. This means that the scientist, the modeler, selects elements from reality and abstracts them into a constructed representation. Then the scientist interacts experimentally with this model in order to gain insight regarding both the real world and the world within the models. In this chapter, I try to highlight several determinants of this representation process, meaning several determinants of modeling practices, with the objective to see where forest policy intervenes. We highlight three main determinants. The first one is the target itself. This is because if models are to be used to gain understanding about a target, then models and targets need to resemble one another. The forest sector is usually seen as a supply chain which comprises an upstream segment, which is forestry, and a downstream segment, which is timber industries, with various activities in between, integrated both horizontally and vertically. This target comprises elements of different natures. There are natural facts, such as biological growth. There are technological facts, such as sawmilling, and there are behavioral facts, such as harvesting decisions. And in the models, these facts of different natures are represented using approaches rooted in various disciplines, and this makes forest sector models integrated models. For example, the representation of natural facts usually relies heavily on empirical data, such as data from national forest inventories, and systems dynamics approaches, whereas usually representations of behavioral facts relies more heavily on theoretical approaches, using, for instance, spatial equilibrium and optimization approaches. And there are also mixed empirical theoretical methods in between. Representations also depend on the spatial and temporal scales considered. Timber is related to a particular land use, forestry, and is also a traded commodity, and as a result, forest sector models are usually specialized models. Because they're based on spatial equilibrium, space is most prominently represented through distances and transport costs. But this representation can be either explicit or implicit. In an explicit representation, individual elements can be geolocated on a map-like structure, whereas in an implicit representation, several elements can be aggregated at fictional middle points. The former approach is more common in regional scale models and the latter approach in national scale models. The temporal scales considered in the models depend on the objectives. Usually, forest sector models are concerned with the use of timber resources and with timber markets, and they relate more closely to tactical and strategic planning and consider timescales that range from a year to a century. But the representation of time depends also on theoretical assumptions regarding agents' levels of anticipation, and several modeling paradigms coexist. The second determinant we wanted to highlight is history. History is a determinant of actual current practices. Forest sector models were developed in the late 70s in two research clusters. The first one under the general impulse from the US Forest Service and also at IASA in Europe, who were looking for new ways to explore developments on timber markets and the use of resources. And their approach was rooted in spatial market modeling, systems dynamics, and activity analysis, and had a focus on downstream industries. The second research cluster emerged at Resources for the Future, which is an American research NGO interested in the sustainable use of natural resources, and their work was rooted in classical forest economics and natural resource economics, and had more focus on upstream forestry. Over time, these early models would be updated and refined to be used in outlook studies. At the international level, we can cite, for example, the Global Forest Products Outlook Study from the FAO, or the EFSOS studies in Europe, as well as many national level assessments. Today, there are many models being used. We can give examples of many national level derivatives of models from the first research cluster. We can give the example of the global model from the second research cluster, which has been continuously updated and is still used today, and many intermediaries that seek to synthesize elements from both approaches. All this to say that current practices are still influenced by past developments. To illustrate this, we constructed a network of researchers using papers from the last 28 years, and a bibliographic coupling metric and a method called visualization of similarity. So on this map, items represent researchers, the size of items relates to how many papers have been published, and the distances and the size of links relates to the degree of relatedness between their work. We can see first that each cluster corresponds roughly to one model or one modeling team. Then there is a geographical divide between research in North America and research in Europe. There is also a methodological divide between models based on optimal control, those based on recursive optimization, and others only based on system dynamics. So this shows that more recent research is still structured along historical axes, but we can also highlight the presence of more recent collaborations that transcend these boundaries. The third determinant we wanted to highlight is policy itself. Policy intervenes in several places. First, policy determines the content of the questions asked with the models. This is because policy analysis has meaning when policy goals are pre-existing and clearly defined. The questions asked with the models then can take roughly two different shapes. There are impact analysis and also normative explorations where one seeks to highlight the trajectory to a particular end state. But in both cases, the objective is to inform current policy making and prepare it for the future, which is prospective analysis. Then policy shapes the scope of questions. Some questions are asked at particular scales. For example, questions related to the resource are usually asked at the regional or national scale, whereas questions of trade are usually addressed at the international or global scales. Also, some questions are tied to particular places. Many assessments in America have been devoted to the trade dispute for lumber between Canada and the US, whereas many assessments in Europe have been devoted to bioenergy production in the wake of the EU developing its climate and energy policy. Then, policy influences how demonstrations are carried out with the models. This usually goes to the use of policy documents, the goals and the narratives they contain, to define scenarios used to drive simulation experiments in the world within the model. And finally, policy is often the end user of some results, which are summarized in assessment reports that synthesize future potential trajectories, their implications, and also identify the key relationships to bear in mind for decision makers. So, now we're going to move on to chapter 2, where I focus on forest sector models' specific ability to address environmental questions. Forests provide a wide range of ecosystem goods and services beyond timber. And these goods and services, their production can become management objectives themselves. From a forest owner's perspective, these could be to protect wildlife, to go mushroom picking in the forest, to go on recreational activities, or to pass the forest on to the next generation. From a sectoral perspective, objectives could be to mitigate climate change, to protect water sources, to produce renewable energy, or to protect habitats. And this multiplicity of management objectives is well established in guidelines from the local to the international scale. The question I asked myself was the following. To what extent have these non-timber objectives been introduced and studied with forest sector models from two different dimensions? A policy dimension, meaning which objectives have been studied and what are the questions asked, and then a modeling perspective, meaning from a more technical point of view, how have these objectives been introduced in the models? I proceeded in 3 different steps. First, I performed a systematic search in the literature using keywords, and from titles and abstracts, I identified which papers did include at least one non-timber objective. Then I performed a bibliometric and network analysis on keywords to identify topics and how they had evolved over time. And finally, I did a narrative review of selected papers to give more details about the research questions and the research methods. So, the search yielded 248 articles. Among these, 197 were analysis papers and 51 were either technical reports or theoretical papers or presentation of models. Among the analysis, 56 only focused on timber production or timber trade, whereas 141 included at least one non-timber objective. So we identified the presence of 4 groups of non-timber objectives. The first 2 most common non-timber objectives were the production of bioenergy and the regulation and impacts of climate change. The 3 minor topics were the conservation of habitats and biodiversity, the regulation of disturbance events, and the regulation of water resources. Cultural ecosystem services were notably absent from the sample. If we look at the temporal evolution of the topics, we can see that even though the total amount of published papers has been steadily increasing over time, the amount of papers only dedicated to timber production and trade has remained rather stable. But on the other hand, the share of papers including non-timber objective has been increasing, and especially bioenergy in the last 10 years. And these papers were mostly published in specialized forestry and forest economics journals. If we now have a look at keywords, we're now going to have a look at keywords, so they're represented on this network here. So we can say several things. We identified the presence of 4 different clusters. The first one in red relates to timber market and timber trade. The second one in yellow to the production of renewable energy. The third one to land use dynamics and climate change. And the last one in green to forest management and forest resources. And broadly speaking, this shows that topics in the field are structured along 2 main axes. A first divide between the downstream forest sector and the upstream forest sector, and the other one between traditional forestry questions and on the other side, climate issues. If we look at the temporal evolution of the topics, we can see again that there has indeed been a shift away from traditional forestry questions towards climate issues and especially bioenergy. We're now going to have a look at research questions and research methods. So most of the articles dealing with energy were concerned with assessing the production potential for bioenergy as well as the effectiveness of economic incentives, whereas articles about climate were mostly concerned with assessing the impacts of climate change and the mitigation potential of the forest sector. We also noticed a recent convergence between these 2 issues. Regarding other objectives, articles were mostly impact analysis, focusing on policy measures related to an increase in conservation efforts, the establishment of trade barriers to prevent illegal logging, or prevention and recovery measures before or after disturbances. The common point between these is that they focused on the costs of such measures and on trade-offs with timber production. If we look at methods, we again see differences. The production of bioenergy is often included as a decision variable through conventional market modeling. Carbon dynamics are often explicitly modeled using carbon content coefficients or emission coefficients, and carbon pricing is used as a method to include mitigation objective in the decision problem. On the other hand, the explicit modeling of other objectives is rarer, and they are usually modeled using proxies, simplified proxies. Besides, they're rarely included as decision variables and often as constraints to the optimization problem. If we take a few steps back, the global image is that the closer objectives are to the model's original target, the deeper the integration is, and vice versa. We also highlighted the existence of several recent solutions to improve the integration of environmental objectives. So a first category of solution is the spatial downscaling of models and the consideration of local environmental conditions, which enables an endogenous representation of the objectives. And another one is the establishment of model couplings, meaning several models being used together. And both types of solutions raise issues regarding the data availability, the need to perform multidisciplinary research, or the complexity of models. So I'm now finished with the first section of this work, and we can summarize the 2 first chapters. So in chapter 1, we saw that the representation process in forest sector models, meaning the modeling practices, we highlighted three determinants of these practices. The first one is the features of the target, so the forest sector. The second one is past historical developments, and the third one was policy needs and uses for models. And then in chapter 2, we highlighted that different non-timber objectives had been integrated in the models, but in an uneven and unequal manner. We are now going to move on to the second section, which comprises two applied study cases for the French forest sector. So in these two chapters, I focus on climate change and on the two aspects of climate change, which are mitigation on the one hand and impacts and adaptation on the other hand. In chapter 3, I seek to assess the implications for the forest sector of forest management practices that seek to both produce timber and store carbon in forest biomass. While many previous assessments focused on downstream impacts for industries, we focus on upstream impacts for landscapes and forest owners' decisions. From a methodological point of view, we use Hartman's model of optimal rotations to integrate climate benefits into the forest sector model we use. And we do this at a spatially disaggregated scale, which enables us to consider local environmental conditions. In chapter 4, I focus on climate impacts and in particular on wildfire risk. And we assess the implications for the forest sector of climate-induced changes in wildfire regimes. And this issue is particularly relevant because it brings risks of non-permanence for carbon stocks. From a methodological perspective, we develop a coupling between a forest sector model and a probabilistic fire model to integrate climate-induced uncertainty into our forest sector model and study its propagation. Both cases focus on the French forest sector, which is characterized by a high share of broadleaf species and mixed forests, and very diverse environmental conditions that make a spatial analysis focused on the upstream forest sector relevant. The study object is the French forest sector model, which is a model of the French forest sector, as the name indicates, that comprises a classical spatial price equilibrium market model, but also a very detailed model of forest inventories with more than 8,000 geolocalized pixels. Recent developments also include the creation of an agent-based forest management model. These two developments shortly predate the beginning of my PhD, and they opened new possibilities for analysis, which I leveraged by focusing on the upstream forest sector. So, as I said, in chapter 3, I focus on mitigation through carbon sequestration in forest biomass. But to realize this mitigation potential through sequestration, this implies changes in forest management practices, which can eventually affect the provision of ecosystem services, forest landscapes, or timber industries. Besides, we know from the literature that this sequestration potential and impacts they vary across space because they depend on the local context. Assessments at the scale of the forest stand usually rely on Hartman's model to integrate climate benefits into forest owners' decisions, and they inherently take into account the local context by using site-specific or species-specific forest growth models, but they lack generalization power. On the other hand, assessments at the scale of the sector offer a broader scope, but they often omit considering local conditions, and they rather focus on impacts for downstream industries. Here, we tried to bridge the gap between these two approaches by introducing Hartman's model into the French forest sector model at a spatially disaggregated scale, meaning the scale of the model's pixels, and as a result, sectoral trends emerge from multiple decisions across heterogeneous environmental conditions. We use recent estimates of the social value of mitigation activities in France, and we compare results of the simulation with a baseline case where climate benefits are not taken into account. We're going to have a look at results in several steps, starting with carbon dynamics. So compared to the baseline, as could be expected, carbon stocks increase over time by around 100 million tons by the middle of the century and almost 500 million tons by the end of the century. In the short term, this is largely due to the postponing of harvests, and in the longer term, it is increasingly due to changes in forest investments. And this delay is because newly established forests need several decades before they grow and represent a significant amount of carbon. However, this sequestration potential is not evenly distributed. On this map, the pie charts show the share of sequestration that is additional compared to the baseline. And we can see that it is mostly located in northern and western regions, which are the regions where harvests are postponed the most and where growth dynamics are the fastest. We're now going to have a look at underlying management changes. The first changes concern rotation times that increase by up to 100%, as illustrated here for broadleaf high forests. The second changes concern investments, and we highlight a moderate decrease in investments in coniferous plantations towards other forest types. However, coniferous plantations in the simulations remain the most popular choice, and besides, these changes are limited to specific locations, which are locations where the replacement forest types show a higher than average growth potential. The last management change we highlight concerns forest covers, and we highlight an increase in forest cover changes after harvests by around 50%. This means that once climate benefits are factored in, there is a redistribution of forest covers across space, which leads to local changes in the landscape. And overall, land is more often allocated to forest types with a faster growth. Over time, these changes lead to changes in the landscape, which we here represent as net changes at the regional scale. By the end of the century, French forests comprise a moderately lower share of coniferous forests and a higher share of mixed and broadleaf forests, as well as a higher share of large and older trees. These changes are net changes at the regional level, but we also highlighted that there were intra-region changes in how the landscape is allocated across space. The key message is that we introduced climate benefits into forest owners' decisions into the French forest sector at a spatially disaggregated scale, which led us to highlight the importance of considering local environmental conditions and how they vary across space. Our results suggest that sequestration policies may present co-benefits in terms of landscape amenities or biodiversity, but that they also might create tension with policies that seek to increase harvests and make silviculture more dynamic, which is actually the case here in France. They also suggest a regionalized approach to sequestration policies. It looks rather hard, for instance, to increase carbon stocks in the southern regions, and their policy may rather focus on stabilizing already existing carbon stocks, which are exposed to risks of non-permanence. And this is the topic of the final chapter. So here I focus on wildfire risk. Today, wildfires mostly affect the southeastern corner of the country, but under the influence of climate change, it is expected that wildfire regimes will become more intense and also expand to new areas. So fires have obvious impacts on the resource, but in addition, they are particularly relevant because they bring risks of non-permanence to carbon stocks, which can come and disturb mitigation objectives. So far, fires have been little studied with forest sector models for two main conditions. The first one is that the models usually do not consider fine-grained details in environmental conditions, and the second one is that they are usually deterministic, whereas on the other hand, fires are highly localized, stochastic events that depend on local weather and environmental conditions. So our method relies on establishing a coupling between the French forest sector model on the right and a model of wildfire activity on the left. Wildfire risk is often seen as comprising three main components, which are fire likelihood, behavior, and effects. Here, we represent fire likelihood and behavior through two emergent properties, which are fire occurrence probability and fire size. And to do this, we adapt a model of wildfire activity recently developed for southern France. We model wildfire events as a Poisson point process that depends on two main predictors: The first one is forest area, and the second one is the fire weather index, which is an indicator for wildfire danger. Because the fire weather index depends on local weather conditions, we can use climate simulations to drive our experiment. And we consider 5 different climate models as well as 3 different climate scenarios, which are a continuation of current climate and also RCPs 4.5 and 8.5. On the other hand, wildfire effects, are represented by using mortality coefficients that are derived from the empirical literature and from expert advice. The wildfire model is probabilistic, and we make multiple replications of each scenario to propagate uncertainty into the French forest sector model. In the end, uncertainty in results comes from 4 different climate sources: interannual fluctuations in weather conditions, stochasticity within the fire model, the choice of the climate model, and the choice of the forcing level. And we assess the relative contribution of each of those sources to total uncertainty in results by partitioning variance. Contrary to the previous chapter, we only focus on the southern half of the country. We'll have a look at results in 4 different steps. First, fire activity. As you can see on the 2 maps, it is expected that wildfire danger, with the fire weather index here, will increase strongly by the end of the century, especially in the southeastern section of the study area and in the western Aquitaine region. This leads to increases in burnt areas, as shown on the table. For example, in RCP 8.5, burnt areas increase by an average of 55% compared to current climate, but this increase is higher in some regions and goes almost all the way up to plus 70%. Burnt areas show a high degree of spatial and temporal variability. As you can see on the first graph on the right, burnt areas for 2 different simulations are quite highly variable from one simulation to another and also from one year to another. And then, as you can see on the bottom maps, burnt areas are quite highly variable from one location to another location. Now let's have a look at impacts on the forest sector. In this table, I compare results in RCP 8.5 simulations to the baseline simulation without fires. In green, you'll have impacts on the resource, and in blue, impacts on the industry. As could be expected, mortality in the forest increases by around 11% on average. Even though this is quite low in absolute terms, it leads to a decrease in available timber inventories by around 5% by the end of the century. Harvests depend on available timber volumes, and they decrease moderately by around 1.5%. This leads to increases in product prices, especially for softwood products. This is because in our simulations, coniferous forests are relatively more affected by fires than broadleaf forests. Forest owners anticipate increases in mortality due to fires, and expected revenues decrease for all forest types, except for softwood forests in the long term, and this is because of the increase in product prices in the long term. Let's now have a look at the impacts of climate change. Overall, the trends I just described are valid in all climate scenarios, but impacts are more intense, more severe, with higher levels of warming, which we represent here in this table as the relative difference in impacts between RCP 8.5 simulations and simulations with a constant climate. But when we look at the absolute figures, we see that numbers remain quite low, and the differences across scenarios can only be witnessed by the last decades of the simulation. For example, mortality almost doubles. It leads to an extra loss of timber volumes by around 40%, but this in the end only represents 1.8% of total timber volumes. Now let's have a look at the propagation of uncertainty. So on these 2 graphs, I represent the relative contribution of each of the 4 sources of climate-induced uncertainties to 2 different dynamics. On the left, fire activity, illustrated with burnt areas, and on the right, forest sector dynamics illustrated with harvest levels. So interannual fluctuations in weather conditions in orange account for a very high share of uncertainty in fire activity throughout the simulation. The same is true for forest sector dynamics, but only for up to a few decades. Then in blue and green we can see that there is an increase in both cases in the relative contribution of climate model uncertainty and climate scenario uncertainty, and in the case of the forest sector dynamics, they overwhelmingly dominate in the second half of the simulation. Replication uncertainty in yellow is due to stochasticity in the fire model. Its contribution to uncertainty in wildfire activity is quite low, but it is much higher in forest sector dynamics, where it peaks at mid-simulation and goes up to 30% in the case of some variables. If we look at the total levels of uncertainty, we can see on the left that it begins at a rather high level for burnt areas and then increases moderately, whereas on the right, it begins at a very low level for forest sector dynamics and then increases strongly. What can we say about this? Well, the fact is, even though burnt areas may be very high, they still only affect a limited share of forest resources. So even though interannual fluctuations in burnt areas may be very high, their impact on the forest sector is quickly dampened. But on the other hand, burnt areas are removed from production for several decades before the forests can grow again. So their impact is cumulative. And this explains why we have an increasing uncertainty and an increasing divergence across our scenarios. In the end, these results highlight the necessity to consider multiple climate outlooks for bioeconomic simulations in the long term, to consider several climate models when possible, and also to consider the inherent variability in disturbance processes. So far, our modeling of fire activity was almost only based on weather conditions. But we know from the literature that there are also land use and socioeconomic determinants for wildfire activity. For example, fires are more numerous close to roads or close to cities. So what I did is that I conducted an exploratory analysis of the influence of such factors on wildfire occurrence. I considered 12 predictors commonly found in the literature, which were spatialized, and I used boosted regression trees, which is a machine learning algorithm. Here are the general results for fire occurrence, and the main thing to see is that in addition to forest area in green, which is already included in the model, 4 variables rank quite highly in terms of relative influence on the fire occurrence metric. And these are good candidate variables to be integrated into the fire model. And this could improve the prediction of the spatial patterns of wildfire activity. And the 4 variables are the ratio of shrubland over high forest, the density of roads, the density of population, and the presence of discontinuous urban fabric, which is a proxy for the wildland-urban interface. I have reached the end of this presentation, and I'd like to take the last remaining minutes to highlight the main contributions, but also the main limitations. From a methodological perspective, we assessed the extent to which environmental objectives had been introduced in forest sector models, and we highlighted several solutions to a better integration. Then we introduced climate benefits into forest owners' decisions in the French forest sector models to enable considering local environmental conditions and how they vary across space. We also introduced a probabilistic component into our model to assess the propagation of climate-induced uncertainties in the forest sector. From a policy perspective, we highlighted several determinants of modeling practices, and we also clarified some of the relationships between models and policy, which are important information for model developers and model users going forward. In the applied study cases, we also highlighted the spatial implications and potentials of sequestration policies, And we also brought several elements of discussion regarding wildfires and the risks of non-permanence for carbon stocks. However, this work has several important limitations which all offer avenues for further research. First, I focused only on one land use, which is forestry, but we know, for example, from the literature that afforestation could be an important lever for carbon storage, or that, as we just saw, wildfire activity also has land use determinants. These are aspects I'd like to investigate in the future, and I am currently involved in a project to study the land use determinants of wildfire activity. Second, my work focused on one tool, which is forest sector models. These tools are well suited for some types of analysis, such as exploration, but not so much for other things, such as predictions. So their results must be compared to those obtained with other methods. In the future, I am particularly interested in multiple criteria decision analysis methods, and I am currently involved in a small-scale project where we're going to use a spatialized multiple criteria decision analysis with stakeholder input to assess the local vulnerability of the landscapes to wildfires. And finally, I performed two applied study cases, but these only considered each of them one factor taken in isolation of everything else. So in the future, it would be a good thing to consider probably wider transition pathways for the forest sector, or maybe multiple disturbance events that can affect one another. And these are all avenues for further research in the months and the years to come. So I have now reached the end of this presentation. So thank you everyone for listening to me, and we can now move on to the discussion with the jury. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for this very clear presentation of your work. Also, thank you very much for keeping the time perfectly, exactly 45 minutes. Let me then give the floor to your first rapporteur, Dr. Valentin Bellassem. Valentin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Franck. Thank you, Miguel, for this presentation, which was, I have to say, as clear as the manuscript itself. Overall, I have many compliments to address, as you've seen in the written report. I think your thesis is of high rigor, both in terms of method and arguing. Always the results are clearly exposed and discussed. I also appreciated the fact that, say, the policy relevance, I think, or more generally, the general interest of your result goes increasing with the thesis. The first two chapters, I think, are largely descriptive and methodologic, but then as the third and the fourth, in the third and the fourth, you more and more explore policy relevant questions and come to policy relevant results. So that being said, of course, I'm interested in discussing several areas where I found either small paradoxes or where I'm uncertain to which extent I've so well understood the manuscript. The first paradox I found actually relates both to, I think, the thesis in general and your first chapter, and regards validation of the models. You actually conclude your thesis in the very last paragraph of it with how important it is, but despite stating this, you barely talk about it in the first chapter, and never or little show validation of your model in the empirical chapters. And I think that's not specific to you and to your work. To the extent that I know the domain, I think it's kind of a general trend in forest sector models, which I have witnessed the limitation in terms of when it comes to provide policy relevant conclusions. I was a member of the expert group assessment, the expert group of the European Union to assess the national forestry action plans which were required to use models, not necessarily bioeconomic models. Some were only ecological models, but some were bioeconomic. And several countries, France being one, but was also the case for Finland, were severely criticized for the inability of their model to reproduce past historical data. So this leads me to two questions. First, I mean, the ability to refute a tool or a conclusion, I think, is the basis of science, as Karl Popper said. So, would you agree then with say the constatation that FSMs are very rarely validated, that then their scientificity is disputable because they don't meet this basic criteria for science? And if not, I would be interested in all the heavy review work you conducted to, if you could bring me some elements on how frequently and how FSMs actually undergo validation exercises, and what is their average prediction ability.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. So I'm going to share my screen again. So following your report, I've been working a bit on this. So you should be able to see something now. Yeah. So I've been looking at the general literature on how simulation models in general are validated. So I think the first element in this discussion is that there is no one absolute method for validation, and that it is always in relation. It has to be. I mean, validation is related to the intended use of the models, so it all depends on what you're going to do with the model. And there are several steps in validation. So here on this general graph, in the green area, you can see more like experimental sciences that are concerned with the real world, and in blue is the world of the model, of the simulation model. And validation is performed in different places. So first there is the validation of what they call system theories, which are the theories describing the real world. So this is largely outside the models. Then you have conceptual validation, which is ensuring that the conceptual model built from these system theories, well, assuring that the model is the logical model, which is it consistent with the theories? Then you have internal validation or verification, which is the implementation of the model in the computer software consistent with how it has been created from a conceptual perspective? And then there is finally operational validation, which is concerned with simulation results. And then the question is, how is model output consistent with the intended use? So if we look at the three orange things, so conceptual, internal, and operational validation, I would say that in the case of forest sector models, conceptual and internal validation are routinely done by people who develop and use them. So this is the case because, for instance, the people who develop these models are scientists who have a good mastery of the theories on which they build the models, and also because model development and model use often includes field experts, such as forest agencies, for instance, and also because being part of science, there is always peer review in articles, in conferences, to assess this conceptual and internal validation of models. And then the internal validation is also routinely made by people who actually perform the simulations and make sure that everything works all right. So I think your question relates more to the left-hand side, which is one part of validation, which is operational validation. In this case, there are many different methods, both objective or subjective, and they can be generally classified along two axes, which are on one hand exploration methods, which are mostly concerned with model results and exploring them, and on the other hand, comparison methods, which are concerned with comparing outputs with something else. And then you have subjective methods, which are interested in the general orders of magnitude of the direction of results, and quantitative methods on the other hand. So I checked the literature in forest sector models to see what was done and what wasn't done. And well, globally what happens is that, so the things in green are quite well made, I think. So overall, the exploration methods are used quite often. So, for example, researchers often do a data correctness check to verify that nothing weird happens. Scenario analysis is very common in the field. It's a core method. We consider always several scenarios and compare them. Sensitivity analysis is quite common in a reduced form, where it focuses on the parameters used in one particular study. And then comprehensive sensitivity analysis, there are less examples, but all of them are recent. There are 4 different papers on comprehensive sensitivity analysis in the last 10 years, and they're becoming more common, I think. And then uncertainty analysis is less common because most of the models are deterministic, but some articles also are doing it, and quite recently. On the other side, so the comparison methods, where one compares results to something else, so it could be other models, could be historical data, or could be experiments. These methods are less used. So comparison to other models are done often. So this is found in the discussion of the papers. And there is actually a model intercomparison project being set up, well, I think it started last year, using several forest sector models to analyze the same scenarios. And several papers have been published on comparing different modeling paradigms on the same scenarios. On the other hand, comparison of results to historical data is not done very often. There are several examples. If you want more details, I have some other slides with examples, but overall they're not very common, at least in the published literature. And I think it mostly relates to the fact that the system is only partly observable. Yes, models, forest sector models simulate things that you could measure in reality as well, such as product prices. But I think to a large extent, the system is partly observable, and I think that's one of the main problems. For example, there's this paper by Mendelssohn et al. Last year, who made a retrospective analysis of the carbon sink in the US, I think. So they had their model start 100 years ago, and in their paper they highlighted that such an exercise wasn't possible for a long time because we didn't have data, and as people reconstruct the past history of the forest and have more and more data available, it becomes done more often. But in any case, this comparison to historical data is not done that often. And then the comparison to predictions is not really done either, because it is quite hard to make experiments like lab experiments on the forest sector. So this is not done very often. And then regarding the top right methods, so these methods usually include the need to use confidence intervals of statistical tests, and they are not usually used in forest sector models. I think it probably relates to the fact that models are deterministic. I haven't had the time to focus on this method for now, but I haven't found any example. I think the global thing is that I would say these models are validated conceptually, and they are validated internally, and they are also validated operationally through subjective and semi-objective methods, through exploration and comparison to the literature and other models. Some methods are becoming more common. So, for instance, comprehensive sensitivity analysis or intermodal comparisons. And the limit lies at the comparison with, for instance, real data. And this relates to the system's observability. But in the end, I mean, is it a real problem? Because I think, as I said in the beginning, validation mostly relates to what you intend to do with your models. And I think as long as these models are mostly used for exploration and not so much for prediction, it's not so much of a problem. Of course, it would be better if models were operationally validated, but in the end, as long as you're cautious, I think, with what you do with your results, I think it's all right. And I would conclude that they are reasonably validated given the limitation of data access and given the use that is intended for them today.
Thanks for your exhaustive question. Let me just note that in practice, those models are used for prediction, even the, say, most precise type of prediction like forest reference levels. And that's, and thanks for the very exhaustive kind of answer, but in the LULUCF regulation, the European Union clearly defines what it means by validation. And it means the ability to reproduce historical data. So that was your comparison with data. And there, and as you've shown, and I think it confirms my impression, it's rarely done. But let's move to another point. So in your, which is also a small paradox I found in your chapter 2, I mean, despite highlighting the importance of policy as driving the development of models, you focused, as you mentioned in your oral presentation, on the discussion of objectives and methods, and you don't discuss at all the results. So I guess I had two kind of very broad overall questions that I think policymakers are entitled to ask someone who has spent a PhD studying the question of climate change in forest and all this. And these overall questions would be first, so based on your overall knowledge on your work, if our objective is to maximize climate change mitigation for the forest sector, should we increase or should we decrease harvest? And maybe more generally than this first question, out of your work, what would be the one or maybe two, max three levers you have identified to maximize the contribution of the forest sector to climate change mitigation?
Thank you for the question. So regarding the second chapter, I think I didn't spend much time on talking about the results of the studies because the intention behind the chapter was to focus on methods, and that's why we also submitted it to a modeling journal and not a general forest science or climate science journal. So that's why we give little space, almost no space to results. But I've had a look at what general modeling studies say and if they agree or not. So there are actually, like most of the studies using forest sector models focus on one particular lever, and there are like impact analysis focusing on one policy measure. And the studies that seek to assess the optimal combination of different levers and different measures are quite rare. So usually they focus only on one, sometimes on two, and they can assess synergies or trade-offs between the two. But it's quite rare to find studies that integrate all levers at the same time and seek to find the optimal balance. I think that's because if you want to consider sequestration, afforestation, land use dynamics, substitution, etc., you need to have a very comprehensive model. And because climate mitigation is also an international endeavor, you also need an international or global scale model, and these models are quite rare, I think. But if I had to make a broad summary of the results obtained with such models, there are several papers that actually, they put forward that there are synergies actually between, for instance, bioenergy production and carbon sequestration in the forest, which could be counterintuitive. And what they advance in their studies is that the synergies go through land use dynamics at the global stage. For example, what they conclude is that when bioenergy is promoted, it increases forest rents, which leads to forest owners farmers afforesting land into forest, which leads to higher sequestration as well as providing timber for energy purposes. So that's the kind of positive interactions that they highlight, but they also highlight that the temporal dimension is important, with some synergies that could taper off in the long term when bioenergy demands maybe stabilize in the end. And they also highlight that there are, spatial determinants to these synergies and trade-offs, because, for instance, there's a paper that was published in December, I think, where they highlighted, it's Austin et al., and they highlighted that most of the mitigation, when you consider all levels at the global stage, would come from the tropics through avoided deforestation, whereas in Europe, mitigation, if you consider an optimal pathway, mitigation would happen in later stages, so in several decades, and mostly through improved management and extended rotations. So just this to say that there are synergies, and they depend on the spatial and the temporal scales considered. But this kind of study with forest sector models are quite rare, because models able to integrate all these levels endogenously and focus on the optimal pathway, they're quite rare.
Yeah, thanks for your answer. I think that's also what I noticed in the draft IPCC report. I see that my time is running out, so I will limit myself to one last question, which is too bad, because it relates to chapter 3, which I found very interesting. And in particular, I found very interesting some counterintuitive results you point out. So to the extent that you can remember my two questions, I will appreciate a little hint on both, but I will focus on one, because I think there is no time for both.
Go ahead with Valentin. Go ahead with both. I think we can allow for that, please.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Franck. The first counterintuitive result, which you point out, is that putting a price on carbon increases harvest in 3 regions. So center, Auvergne-Limousin, and southeastern France. I spent some time thinking about it and trying to understand how you explain it and how I can understand it. And wait, sorry, I have to stop my timer. Okay. And the way I understood that, it was that it was mediated by trade between regions. Basically, the overall effect is to decrease harvest, but then regions where harvests bring the lowest value per ton of carbon, then in those regions, harvest may increase, and so I translated this into the value of wood itself, which would have made me conclude that the region where harvest could increase would be the region where wood for construction, I mean high value wood, bois d'oeuvre, would be the highest. And this may fit correctly with Centre and Auvergne-Limousin, but would barely fit with southern France. So I was interested in, maybe I didn't understand perfectly, maybe I didn't interpret correctly, so I was interested in your answer to that. And the second and partly related question that you mentioned again in your oral presentation is that intuitively, and that's what you say, carbon pricing will favor fast-growing species. And that's actually a crucial societal debating point in France, where NGOs worry that things like label bas carbone will favor conifers, which they don't like. But what you show is that despite that, you show more investment towards mixed and broadleaf species and an increase of cover from these two species. So to the extent I understand your argument is that it occurs in places where conifers are not well suited, they grow fast there, but nevertheless they are there, which so contradicts what NGOs are fearing, and it also to some extent contradicts my old deal tables. So yeah, I was wondering if you had second thoughts on this topic and what you made of it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to be shorter on the response this time. So I went back, regarding the first question, so I went back to the simulation results. So I looked at what was happening in that region that you mentioned. So if we look in details, we see that the increase in harvest concerns one product that is actually exported to another region, which is the Grand Est, I think. So we have this intuition that it is due to the resolution of the spatial equilibrium, and the rationale behind this is that the regions are not isolated, so it might be more efficient in terms of the model's objective function, the total economic surplus, for some regions to decrease their harvest more than they would if they were isolated, and to import the rest from other regions. And to test this, what I did is that I made a new simulation where I cut the region, Languedoc-PACA, from the rest of the country. So I cut it off, no trade possible, with the same simulation to test whether or not it was actually due to trade. And what we see in that new simulation results is that indeed harvest decreased now in the region instead of increasing, and they decrease a lot. I think it was around 25%, which is much higher than in the national scale. So in this sense, I can say that I have a reasonable level of confidence that it is the resolution of the spatial equilibrium that brings this result. And regarding the second question, so in the model, we have national forest inventory data on each forest's speed of growth, and then we have their distribution at the regional level, and the model initializes by making random draws in this distribution to affect each pixel with a multiplicative coefficient that increases or decreases the growth of the forest compared to the regional average. What happens when we do this is that we can have some pixels where coniferous forests grow a bit more slowly than the average, whereas other forest types can grow a bit faster than the average. And what we highlight in the chapter is that these replacements of coniferous forests by other forest types mostly happen on pixels where the replacement forest types grows much faster than average. Here it's quite hard to pinpoint, like to really highlight why this is. So there is this fact of heterogeneous coefficients that I just described, but then other factors come in, such as the carbon density of each forest type, which is not the same. Then there is also the ratio between the biomass in the stem and the biomass in the branches and the roots, which is also not the same depending on the forest. So we have several parameters that could influence the results, and in the end the replacements are quite limited to some places. So I cannot tell you exactly why this is. The intuition is it's because of how heterogeneous growth conditions are represented in the model, and it could happen that at the pixel level, because it's based on the statistical distribution at the pixel level, what the model describes is not reality. So that's why we always have to aggregate results at higher levels. In the end, I think concerning these two questions, the fact of why do we observe these things, I think it relates to more generally one of this type of model's strength and weakness. The strength is that you can integrate multiple factors across space and across time and multiple relationships and then identify the key relationships. But on the other hand, it's also a weakness because sometimes you have difficulty in highlighting why some parameters are important or not. So regarding this second question, I don't really have an answer in addition to what is in the chapter. But what I can say is that when we look at the model calibration data, overall, indeed, coniferous forests grow faster than broadleaf forests. So my intuition is that it is mostly due to the interaction between this heterogeneous environmental conditions plus the carbon density plus the biomass repartition in the trees.
Thanks a lot for the very detailed answer, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate the extra simulation to try and answer it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Valentin. And I yield the floor to your second rapporteur, Dr. Jean-Denis Maca. Please.
Hi everyone. First, I would like to thank you for the quality and the clarity of your talk and of your slides. Then I have several questions about your PhD. First, I really appreciate chapter 1 because it is very important to have the representation of the economic sector in models, in economic models, because it is important to have the history of the sector forest modeling in order to understand where we are and where we are going. So, but first, I have a very simple question. It is about the social representation in the forest sector modeling, and it is about the social representation, because as you said, policy is one determinant of the representation, and I would like to have your opinion and about how governance is represented, or decision-making process, or, for instance, behavior of forest owner and interactions with decision makers, or institutional economics like transaction cost. Sorry. So my first question is, what do you think about the social representation in the sector forest modeling?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. So in most forest sector models, the hypothesis is that of representative agents. So if we take the example of the market models in forest sector models, they're equilibrium models where we assume that in a region, the behavior of all timber suppliers is represented as the decision of one representative agent, one timber supplier. So in this sense, we can say that individual forest owners are not represented so much in the classical forest sector models. But then there are recent developments where people seek to integrate more diversity in what happens. So I can give you two examples from the top of my mind. The first one is that of our model, the French forest sector model, where in 2015 and 16, two papers were published, where one paper was published that explains how a new management module was added to the model, and there agents are represented at a more disaggregated level. So within one region, instead of having one representative agent for forest management, you have a collection of individual agents that are characterized by heterogeneous risk aversion, heterogeneous growth conditions in their own forests. So that's a heterogeneous forest management model. That's a first step towards representing more diversity. And there is also a model from Finland. So I don't know it as well, but they also have different types of forest owners in their market level model, some valuing only timber and some only also valuing other amenities. So examples exist, and they're mostly recent. So I think it's still under development. And then
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So okay, thank you for your response. I have another question about chapter 2, because I appreciate this chapter also. you mentioned the importance of introducing non-timber objectives, and I have a question about optimization, because as you read in my report, I have some concerns about optimization with some non-timber objectives. For instance, if you take the example of biodiversity, I'm not sure that we can optimize biodiversity. So, of course, in economic, we use utility function with discounting rate and so on. So it is very useful for many examples, but you know, there are some streams, some schools in natural resources management where we try to use other approaches because some people are aware that optimal pathway sometimes present some difficulties to represent the real behavior because we don't optimize everything. So it is not an easy question, but I would like to have your opinion about the use of optimization, because a person uses optimization. If I correctly remember, you optimize the economic surplus net of transportation costs, if I correctly remember somehow. But I would like to have your feelings and your opinion about the fact that some non-timber objectives can be some constraints. For instance, we can comply with biodiversity constraints and optimize an economic function. And I would like to have your feeling and your opinion on this aspect.
Okay. Thank you for the question. So yes, so as you said, forest sector models are based on optimization approaches, and usually so on the maximization of total economic surplus net of transport costs. And so as we highlight in the second chapter, this becomes sometimes a limitation in the case of non-timber objectives, because it requires, well, for an objective to be included in the model's objective function, we need to have an estimate for an economic value. And for some objectives, it's not so easy. So for instance, for carbon dynamics, carbon pricing is often used, but then for other objectives, it is much harder to estimate a value. And as you said, in the case of biodiversity, for instance, it can become problematic. So what happens is that most of the studies that focus on biodiversity, for instance, they impose constraints on the optimization problem to verify some condition, for instance, setting aside a certain amount of forest that would not be harvested. But then this leads to several objectives being at different levels, different statuses, because some will be constraints and some will be objectives. So this brings almost philosophical questions, but it's in the end related to how models were built in the first place. But then this constraint approach is quite common in lower scale models. So they're not really forest sector models, but more like forest operation optimization models at the landscape or the property scale. And I think from what I've read, constraints are often included in these models to preserve some areas, to make sure that harvests stay at least constant, etc., etc. In the case of forest sector models, some other approaches are being used, but they're quite rare. So I saw a paper from, I don't remember the name, but it was in 2018, and they were using, it's still optimization, but they were using goal programming instead of maximization of economic surplus. And this enabled them to have, they had two objectives, forest production and carbon sequestration, but they didn't really have, I think, to monetize the carbon, and they had two objectives in two different units, and they were minimizing so the deviations from the value. And then there are some examples also of forest sector models that use purely systems dynamics approaches. There's a model developed in Austria that is only based on systems dynamics, so everything is described in terms of fluxes and pools, and not so much in terms of optimization. So there is no economic equilibrium, I think, and supply and demand oscillate around equilibrium values but are never optimized at the same time. So there are other approaches, but they're minor, I think, so far.
Okay, thanks. And maybe a short question before moving towards chapter 3, just about optimal pathways and your optimal solutions. Did you try to take a look on the robustness of the optimal pathway? Because sometimes it can be optimal, but if you have a small patient, then the system collapses.
So in my case, no, I didn't do this directly. I didn't do this. I mean, I didn't do it. Also because our model is not based on. Well, we will simulate the evolution of the forest sector for a given amount of years, but our model is recursive, so there is an optimization every year, but we're not trying to find the optimal temporal pathway to a particular end state. So there is no question of optimization over time. So I'm not sure how I could do it with this recursive framework. But then one could imagine in an optimal control version of our model to do some kind of sensitivity analysis to see if this pathway is robust or not.
Right. Okay, thanks. So let's move to chapter 3. So yeah, I have a question about territorial inequalities, as mentioned in figure 3.4, if I correctly remember, because you have an increase and decrease of harvest according to the different region. So I don't really remember the percentage. Yeah, for instance, Auvergne Mouzin as a positive change. Yeah, so I would like to ask you if it will be possible to try to introduce some territorial inequalities. It's my first question, but it's not the most important question I have in mind. The second one is what about the critical times and the critical locations? Did you try to identify some critical times and critical locations in your results in order to see if we have to act at the right time and at the right locations. Because when you have some transition pathway, you have to be aware about these critical times and locations.
Okay, thank you for the question. So regarding the first part of your question and these territorial inequalities, I would say that the model is regionalized and it implicitly takes into account part of them because it is calibrated from observed data on local timber industries, their costs, transport costs also. So implicitly, and the local resource as well. So implicitly, it takes into account indirectly some of the features of the local forest and the local industries. And one manner to improve this could be model downscaling with a more explicit representation of space and where things are located and etc. etc. Then I'm not sure I understood the second part of your question about the critical locations.
Yeah. Because so it is not it is for chapter 3 and maybe also for chapter 3. So you have a lot of results and you are looking the dynamics over time, right? From now to 2100, sorry, and in France. And I would like to know, because I don't have all results in your PhD, but I would like to have your feeling and your opinion. If, for instance, in the change or in some results, we have some critical times, or if we can have some critical times according to some scenario or some policy about the change in terms of harvest or something like that. Because, for instance, for the climate change, we need to move in 2050 to the carbon neutrality or something, and then we have to move maybe much more, but whatever. And you have some transition, and I would like to know, or if some time or locations are very sensitive according to your results. Maybe I can formulate my question like this.
Okay.
For instance, I don't know if there is a specific region which is very critical. For instance, if we remove Auvergne-Limousin, what happens? Is it a critical location? Is it a critical region for you? Or if we remove, I don't know, another region, for instance, contest, is it critical for the other regions or not? So you cannot remove regions like this, of course, but it is, like sensitivity analysis, but in time and in terms of locations.
Okay, I think I understand better. Thank you.
Okay.
So I didn't do something like this so far, but I think results themselves can give us some intuition about this because we can look at if we look at, for instance, carbon sequestration, we can look at how it is distributed across space, so we can see which regions are more critical from that point of view. But apart from this, I haven't done really anything like what you just described. And about the critical time, it's quite complicated because again the model is recursive, so I don't really see how I could do it. But then if we look at chapter 4 and what you describe as sensitivity analysis, I think we're doing it in chapter 4 because that's one of the main limitations of forest sector models is that they're deterministic, and and usually uncertainty, risk, they're most of the time they're treated through scenario analysis. So you consider several scenarios, like what I did in chapter 3, 3 different carbon price paths, but it's quite hard to go beyond. So what I wanted to propose in chapter 4 was a more systematic analysis. It focuses on one thing, which is forest fires. But in the end, chapter 4, if we set aside the fires, it is a sensitivity analysis of the forest sector regarding timber mortality. Basically, that's what it is. And because we have burned areas that vary from one year to another, from one simulation to another, from one location to another. So I think results can tell us things about this, and especially regarding how uncertainty is distributed among the 4 sources of uncertainty. What I still have left to do is to dig deeper into our simulation results because I haven't finished looking at the results, but I plan on looking at results, uncertainty results at the regional level and at different points in time. But this I have only partly done it so far. But I think introducing this probabilistic component into the model is a good way of assessing the things you described. And I would say it's a more recent endeavor in forest sector modeling to introduce these systematic uncertainty analysis, etc. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So, concerning chapter 4, so I have some questions to you. So, you have a probabilistic model, and then you have different results, and you plot the main results and the variability, right? But I would like to know if you try to analyze the extreme events. Why? Because when you are decision makers, when you try to manage some systems, you have a daily management where you try to cope with daily events, okay? But some you have also to manage extreme events. And sometimes it is very interesting to focus only on the extreme events and to try to have two types of management. So daily events, every year you have some fire, okay, with a given probability, but which is very important is to try to cope with the extreme event. For instance, when it is the fire have only once a century, for instance. So, and it is very important when you try to manage such a risk. So my question is, did you take a look on this extreme event in order to see if you have some kind of vulnerability of some region or something like that? Because we have some difficulties in order to manage the end of the distribution.
Mm. So thank you. So So far, as you said, I haven't really looked at extreme events in isolation. So we use the fire model to simulate fires, and we have a size distribution for fires. So what happens in the simulations is that there are many small fires and much less large fires, but we know there's a literature on extreme fires that shows that large fires will become larger and more common in the future, so it's a relevant question. So the model by itself will simulate sometimes very large fires, but I haven't been looking specifically at this. I've been looking at the average size of fires in our simulations, and I could see that they increased over time, but I didn't do any specific analysis on this. But I think I could get some insight regarding this when I focus on the partition of uncertainty at the regional scale, which I haven't done yet, because we can imagine that maybe interannual fluctuations, which will account for more of the total uncertainty at the regional level or the local level, especially in areas that are prone to larger fires or more numerous fires. So I guess we could get some insight this way, but so far I haven't been really looking at extreme events alone.
Yeah, and it is not only the extreme event in terms of fire, but also in terms of uncertainty. For instance, we have to manage the worst case. And for instance, in figure 4.5, you have different pathways with different uncertainty. And then it is also interesting for managers to know and to see the worst case, because you have a lot of uncertainty. Of course, you have extreme fire, okay, but also because of the uncertainty of your model, and because of the replication uncertainties, the climate uncertainties, model uncertainty, or whatever, you have a lot of uncertainty, and it is interesting to see the worst case in order to have an idea of the stakes of the management.
Okay.
And yeah, so and I have maybe one last question or two. I take a look at the time.
Briefly.
Okay. Yeah. So so I will try to match two questions. Two questions. So I would like to have your feeling opinion in terms of perspective, in terms of management, because we you not not we you did a great work with a lot of things, and I would like to know if you have in mind some works about management or adaptive management, and how to integrate this in your model. Because then, of course, because you have some extreme events, or you have some uncertainty in terms of economics, in terms of climate, in terms of biodiversity, and so on. And adaptive management is a key issue in order to cope with such uncertainties. And I would like to have your opinion in terms of perspective. How do you think it will be possible to integrate quite easily adaptive management in your model? And if you say yes, how?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think as forest sector models are now, at least our model, it's not so easy because they're large or intermediate scale models, so they're not really well suited to capture fine-grained detail about how agents behave. But I mean, it's just an idea from the top of my mind. But given that there have been endeavors in the last years to develop more agent-based models, maybe this could be a way to go to integrate the aspects you just described. But overall, I think, well, I'm interested in the question of adaptive capacity, but I have actually plans to study it not with forest sector models. If we take the specific example of fires, I have a small scale project now with the colleague where we're going to assess vulnerability in terms of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, but we're rather going to focus on one particular territory in the south of France and participative approaches with local stakeholders rather than using the large-scale model. Maybe this will yield results that we could integrate in large-scale models later, but I'm not sure that they're the right tools to address these questions in the first place.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the clarity of your responses. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn to your first examiner, Dr. Hannah-Catherine Georgi, and my apologies for mispronouncing your name. Please, the floor is yours.
No problem. Thank you so much. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to be part of the jury of this thesis. It's very interesting and very interesting thesis and well done. A lot of extensive work behind both in the practice and in modeling. And I have been enjoying to read it. But since I only only have 10 to 15 minutes of time, so I focus my question on 3 and 4. Regarding chapter 3, the concept implication carbon sequestration. I was wondering about to hear your opinion. What do you think about the impact, and see the impact and the results of these carbon policies that you implemented in the simulator? Are the results as you would have expected, or are you expecting something different, one or the other way?
I'm sorry, but the sound quality was not very good, and I didn't hear everything you said.
Oh, sorry. I hear there's some blurring. Maybe on my side.
What I propose maybe is that all the other members of the jury, if we can turn off our cameras so that we use less bandwidth. And second, maybe if you can speak a little more slowly, that will make up for the bad connection.
Sure. Okay, let's try again. Yes, so I said that I will focus my questions on chapter 3 and 4.
Okay.
And regarding chapter 3, I would like to start by asking you about the impact on the timber price and the harvest results that we got from the simulations of the carbon policies. Were the results as you expected, or were they like different from your expectations based on what you were thinking before, how you know the simulator, the literature, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. I heard the question very well this time. So regarding my expectations, well, knowing the model beforehand, I did expect that harvest would decrease and that prices would likely increase. So I cannot say that simulation outputs were against my expectations. Well, I cannot say I did expect what happened, I think. Or at least I wasn't surprised when I saw the results. I think most of the results that were unexpected was about the regional distribution of the sequestration and about the trade questions that we evoked earlier with the other examiner. But regarding the general trends, I don't think I was that surprised, especially because, well, there was similar works performed before that focused on market impact, so I cannot say that most of the results were unexpected from a market perspective, and that's also why I did it, because we had this model that had heterogeneous environmental conditions and everything, so I really wanted to focus on the distribution of impacts for the resource and the landscape, and I think that's where I had less expectations probably, and where I was keenest on investigating the simulation results in more details.
Okay. Because I was thinking that when I was looking at the work, I was what struck me is that so you simulated in the main scenario a carbon tax of 750 euros per ton, right?
Yes.
And that is timber prices vary, but you can say that basically it's like 10 times the value of timber if you like use the rule of thumb of 1 ton of CO2 per cubic meter wood, which is also a proxy, but still is within the right order of magnitude. So say that one ton CO2 per cubic meter, including that includes almost all this dam and also rent. Probably can be something from 0.7 to 1.4, but that doesn't matter so much right now. But the point being that the carbon values of the trees is more or less in the magnitude of 10 times timber values.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, you didn't. Have you finished or? Yeah. Sorry.
No, I did. I was. So then I was thinking. Then the carbon will steer completely the forest management. Not the market demand for timber, because then suddenly it's just a tenth of the value. So I would expect it to see much higher, much larger increases, much larger changes in the harvest than you have seen because of that.
Okay, thank you. I understand the question. So, so the thing is that the first thing is that the carbon value starts at a much lower level. So since the model is recursive, so the agents will not see the much higher price before it actually happens. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is that we implement this as a rent policy and not as a subsidy tax policy. So the value that we have agents. We have the agents in the simulations behave as if they received a yearly rent, which even in the case of 500 euros, if you use a 3% discount rate, it's much lower. So it's less much, then it becomes less than the price of timber. So this price signal is much lower compared to a case where we would apply a tax subsidy scheme with the full price. So I think that's why it's not that unsurprising that the changes in harvest are not higher. And yes, I agree with you that over time, if we use very high prices, then carbon will steer management altogether. But and in the end, we wanted to use these values because they had been published the year before in this social value of mitigation activities in France. So they should represent all mitigation activities with a lower cost should be implemented to reach mitigation objectives in France. It doesn't mean that we envision a real incentives using these prices for forestry. It's more of a thought experiment. I think this chapter is more of a thought experiment to see how the model behaves in the case where we implement such a policy, and then we took those prices because they were recent and they had meaning from a policy perspective. But in no case do we recommend at this point to implement such a high carbon price for forestry. It's more of a thought experiment and an exploration of the world within the model.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Okay. But then you also said that the rotation length becomes more than double.
Yes.
Yeah. But does that go together with that the harvest decreased only about 5% maybe?
Okay, so in our model we have decisions taken by owners in two different places. So harvest, they're short-term decisions that derive from the market equilibrium and take into account current prices, whereas management decisions, so their replantation or regeneration decisions after harvest, are decided by another module within the model, which is the agent-based model at the pixel level, and this uses the Faustman or Hartman logic. This part of the model is used to decide how owners replant after they harvest. It also incidentally calculates expected rotation times and expected revenues from the owners as a result of the calculation of the land expectation value. But then the only thing that connects to the rest of the model is the regeneration choice. So what you replant and with which management style. The the rotation time is an expected rotation time at the moment the decision is made, but it doesn't. Then the forest just goes back to the inventory model, so it doesn't mean that this rotation time will be respected in the future. So it's an expectation from the owner's perspective at the moment he makes or she makes the decision.
Okay, so it's about. So you mean that it's about the future stats?
So it's the result of the land expectation value calculation. So it represents what the owner expects when he or she makes the decision, but it doesn't mean that it will actually be the case. The calculation of LEV is used to decide which forest type and which management style will be implemented, and this connects to the rest of the model. The expected rotation time is incidental to the calculation. It's an output, but it's a pure output. It doesn't connect to the rest of the model.
Okay. Okay, so then also because I also was wondering about the expected returns from timber, you're reporting that they go down by 95%, and maybe is a similar explanation, because you see that changes in timber prices 10 to 20% up when harvest volumes are about 5% down. But so I couldn't see how the relatively small changes in timber price to harvest translate into such a huge decline in the expected returns from timber.
Yes, so it's the same type of explanation. This expected revenues, they are pure outputs from the management model. So they're expectations derived from the land expectation value calculation, but they do not connect to the rest of the model. So it's the same type of explanation. But then I looked at the literature when I had the results, because in the end I was a bit surprised. But there are examples of there was one paper from the US where they applied the Hartman model with the carbon tax at the stand level using different types of temperate forests for the US. And they showed that they had two scenarios, one with lower carbon prices and one with very high prices, consistent with a lot of mitigation, with stringent objectives for mitigation. And what they also shown results of the same order of magnitude. So they had rotation times around 300 years and very strong reductions in expected income from timber, also around 80-90%. So in the end, it is consistent with some results from the literature. But inside our model, we really have these two different places where two different decisions are made. So harvests are short-term decision, and replantations are long-term decisions, and not all the results from the land expectation value calculation go back to the rest of the model. So that's why you have those results that could look counterintuitive, but that's why we always label them as expected revenues and expected rotation times, because they're not what will happen in actuality.
Right. No. Okay, thanks for clarification. So in the end, so you see, so we did a similar, some similar studies in Norway some years back that we also referred to here, and that we got much higher impact on the carbon sequestration than in your study. So that was interesting for comparison. So, but I'm still wondering then. So when I read the paper, I kind of feel that the cost seems very high compared to the output in terms of carbon sequestration. So, but you say in this discussion that the actual incentives would likely not require such high value for taking place. But what do you think yourself? Is this cost-effective method?
Sorry, I didn't hear the end at the very end. What you said at the very end.
Yeah, no, I just wonder yourself. What do you think yourself? Do you think that policy seems cost-effective? Yeah.
Okay, I heard this time. Thank you. So what we did, if what we did in the simulation was an actual policy, I think it would be very expensive. So I don't think it would be very effective. So as I said, it's more of a thought experiment about better understanding how the new version of the model with heterogeneous decisions and heterogeneous environmental condition works in case of a carbon policy. And that was the main point of it. So we didn't intend it to be a policy analysis. We didn't intend it to assess the impacts of an actual policy. We saw it as a thought experiment where we would have owners behave as if they took into account the climate benefits of carbon sequestration. And then if we compare indeed to the studies you performed yourself for Norway, indeed impacts were much lower in our case. And it might be due to the fact that we have this carbon rental scheme that has a much lower price signal. And also if I remember correctly, your model had perfect foresight, whereas ours doesn't. So also owners, because they're myopic, they might not take into account the increase in carbon prices in the future, and they might behave differently. So in the end, we really didn't intend to do the same thing as maybe you did in a few years ago, where you really intended to assess some policies. We mostly did a thought experiment and an investigation of the model itself.
Yes, right. Yeah, no, it's definitely many assumptions in the models that differ, but it's always interesting to see some others who are doing some type of similar studies, even with some important differences that you highlight. Thank you so much. So just a question for us, for chapter 4, and it didn't really describe so much in detail in the introduction, but to say that those that have been burned areas has decreased from the 1990s. And I checked a little bit. I couldn't find the numbers just for the south, but I found from whole France that the total burned areas, forest areas, had decreased from 40,000 hectares in 1980 to 10,000 hectares in 2014. So 75% reduction, which is fantastic. But this has happened in a period with warmer climate and as I say, more frequent weather conditions. The burned areas has gone down a lot. And you point yourself to better monitoring and abatement and technology, which probably seems very likely. But I was wondering if you did include some of these factors related to monitoring and abatement capacities in the model, but because since you have used past fire data to build the models that you are for the future, if you didn't include abatement and the monitoring, how can it increase in the temperature lead to more fires in the future? In the past years, fires has decreased with higher temperature.
Okay, thank you for the question. I'm going to share something. I have a graph. So sharing. Yeah, so this graph is taken from a PhD that was defended last year about fires, and they showed the number of fires with the histogram and the burnt areas in red in the southeastern corner of the country. So indeed we can see that there has been a decrease over time. So this is mostly due to improvement in firefighting and fire monitoring, as you said. But the thing is, there were several papers have highlighted that even though this decrease is due to improvement in fire detection and fire prevention and firefighting, the climate influence on fire activities actually it's worsening. And there was an article published last year in 2020 that tried to isolate the climate signal in the evolution of burnt areas. And they showed that, I don't remember the figures exactly from the top of my head, but they actually showed the worsening of the conditions and of the outcome due to climate change. So there are these two antagonistic forces. I'm simplifying because I'm really not an expert in these questions, but there seem to be these two antagonistic forces. On the one hand, the climate and weather determinants, and on the other hand, the firefighting and the fire detection. What we did in the end is that the fire model, so which was mostly developed by my co-authors. The fire model is calibrated from data from the last from 20 years, I think. So from the 1995 to 2015, if I remember correctly. And there was an increase in firefighting efficiency after 2003 because there was a very high amount of fires that year, and the model did include an effect on this to take into account the fact that firefighting and fire detection and everything had been improved after that extreme year. And then we only indeed took into account for the future the fact that we are in this post-2003 era where firefighting has improved, and then we projected into the future by only changing weather conditions. So we only took into account the impact of changes in weather conditions in the future, and we didn't make any assumptions on how firefighting would evolve, and we kind of fixed it at its post-2003 level. So for now, we haven't really investigated this. And the next step today in model development with my co-authors in Avignon is to include land use determinants of wildfire activity patterns into the model. And if this is successful and we have more than weather conditions and forest area, let's say, for instance, landscape fragmentation or urban areas in the model, with this, maybe we could create different scenarios that would take into account maybe firefighting, maybe the use of the landscape, etc., etc. So these are things we could do in the future, but as of today, our simulations, they were only driven by weather data.
Okay. Well, that sounds like an interesting future idea for future research. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I leave the floor to Dr. Marianne Fournier. Marianne.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting me. So it's impressive to be in an economic forum. So I knew Miguel very well in your teaching activities. So I knew you are able to tackle very complicated challenges. Probably it's easier when you have an Antonio in your team, I suppose. And also, I know you are able to present deeply and clearly complicated things. So thank you. Your presentation is very nice, and the manuscript is also very nice to read, even for me, who is not a specialist in economics. And for me, your thesis represents very well what and who you are, really. And I particularly appreciated your chapters 1 and 2. In my sense, they can be read by students in modeling in general, and forest modeling in general, not only economists. It's very interesting for modelers. And so my main questions concerns chapter 3 and 4 in the application. So I was very interested when I discovered that you present models where policy and economic implications, timber and non-timber markets governs landscapes. Because for me, I'm coming from ecological sciences, and for me, landscapes is mainly governed by landscape ecology. So it's very interesting very brave for me to design models where landscapes are governed by. So I tried to understand what was behind that. So tell me if I properly understood. So you have a square cell of 8 by 8 kilometers, right? And in each cell you have an initial volume coming from National Forest Inventory data. This volume, you have several strata, diameter classes, three types of species composition, and 3 types of forest structure. But it is for volumes, right?
Yes.
And then your models calculate harvesting based on the equilibrium, and this harvesting is converted into a free surface, right?
Yes.
Yes. And in this free surface, the forest owner is free to make a new forest, right? And he has to choose the best forest according to the management modules based on Hartmann, Fossmann, and economic, optimized economics of forest management. Okay, so I understand. So does it mean that clear cutting, because for me this conversion from a surface into a volume is not so clear, because in National Forest Inventory, National Forest Inventory give you a list of trees, so it is volumes. Doesn't mean that these trees are close together, so to convert a volume into a surface is not. I remember some discussion with Sylvain a few years ago, so I think it's really, and I think it's really important in the way after it describes landscape changes. Okay? So, do you have some idea about? Is it important to know the way you convert volume into a surface? Does it mean that only clear cutting is allowed in your management system? Or?
Well, so far in the current version of the model, what happens is that regardless of the species composition or the management style, the model assumes that a final cut will happen. Mm-hmm. So this is at the pixel level. So when owners decide what they will replant, they base themselves on the classical Fastman criterion, and they assume a final cut will take place. Then they make their calculation and they attribute the land to the forest type and the management style that has highest returns. The first thing is that we can change the percentage of active management. So we can set up the model to have a percentage of freed area be replanted from natural regeneration without the owner intervening. So that's the first thing. But then the forest owners, they assume a final cut will take place because it's a simplification for this calculation, but it doesn't mean it will actually take place. Because as I said, for the previous examinator, the only result from this calculation is what you choose. So you choose, for instance, pure coniferous forests. And then it goes back to the inventory module where we say, okay, so this area that was free, now it's pure coniferous forest. And then we have the data from National Forest Inventory that tells us how it grows. At some point in time, it will go back to available timber inventories because it grows enough to be harvested. And then we have rules. So the harvest level derives from the equilibrium, the market equilibrium that says, okay, so this is how much we harvest in this region. Then this is disaggregated across the pixels. And the thing is that we have binary parameters in the model, 1 or 0, that tells us whether it is a final cut or not, or if it's just a thinning, for example. And this is defined by the user. So the user will say, okay, so if we cut a 20 centimeter oak, it's not a final cut, so 0. So when this cut happens, it does not free area. It just reduces the volume, the density in that forest. But it's not a final cut. And only when it's a 1, so when it's the binary positive, when it's a final cut, because we said this is a final cut, then this frees area.
Okay. And so, and also you mixed, of course, all kinds of broadleaf species. A poplar plantation and oak forest is the same in your model?
I don't remember exactly. I wasn't here when the model was calibrated, but I do remember that in National Forest Inventory data, the poplar plantations are always separated. Yeah, so I cannot tell you 100% sure right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if they had been set up apart from the rest.
So broadleaf species are mainly long,
the rest.
Long location and so on. And yes, okay, so you're right. And don't you think that nowadays, you know, there's big debates about the plantation of naturally regenerated forests, don't you think this kind of strata could be more relevant than coppice and high forest and so on? Because I think at the beginning we have chosen, I remember when we discussed that with Frank and Sylvain a long time ago, we have chosen the same strata of NFI classes, but probably according to the problem you have to solve, it's not the relevant classes. I think probably it will to investigate how landscape change. Probably classes based on plantation or not, because I'm sure that in the management rules, even it is not only Forstmann, Hartmann, it's also really something very important in the feeling of forest owners, and probably also the difference of ownership between private and because I know that each time the NFI try to calibrate some things, each time they try to calibrate anything, you know, volume equations and so on, there's a difference between private and public forests. They are always relevant. Of course, they never want to use it because it doesn't make sense to say to people, you just have to, you have a private forest owner, just give your forest to the state and the volume in your forest is not the same, of course. But probably for you, when you are trying to model landscape dynamics, it would be interesting to really to make discussions. I can imagine that it is a lot of work for Antonello, and I'm sorry, I don't want to disturb you too much, but I think it's important because really this landscape changes you have presented some results, but it's difficult to know some results are provocative, as Ramita said. So it's difficult to assess if there are really how their levels. So I think for me, I will be more convinced if you have tried different way of representation of the because for me the main problem is the conversion between volume and volume to surface and to the space. Because you have a model based on market and trade based on volume, and you have a landscape model based on space. So not exactly the same. Okay, and so my second comment is the same because you want to enhance interdisciplinary research between environmental sciences and economic sciences. You said at the beginning, I think that it is important because, but your economic models is a great constraint, because okay, you use landscape ecology or behavior of the owner just as a constraint, as a boundary. It is not really the driver of the systems. So, don't you think there's you can have completely different attitude? Just trying, for example, to put some economics in a landscape ecology model. Did you try? And I think it would be interesting to compare different approaches. Approach coming from your economic drivers, an approach coming from landscape ecology, and I would be very interested to know whether they converge or not.
Well, it's thank you for the comment. So, I mean, it's true that multidisciplinary research is a recurring theme, I think, in what I wrote, because coming myself not from economics, but rather from general forest sciences, it was one of the things I had at heart coming into this PhD, trying to do something in between and to draw bridges between several approaches. But I wouldn't say that forest sector models are purely economic tools. I think they're more instruments of translations between different disciplines. So you have a first layer which is a small piece of economic theory, and then you have another piece which is more an engineering approach with system dynamics and pools and fluxes and everything. And then you have mathematical engineering with the optimization. So it's really a melting pot of all these approaches. So I wouldn't say they're purely economic models. They're more of something in between.
Okay, but what I think is not pure economics, but the equilibrium, the optimization between surpluses is really something economical. Economic?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
But you can put inside some non-timber value, I suppose you can have something that's more complicated. Okay, and so my second question is about fire.
Yes.
And so I appreciate also how you had to make hypotheses to make links between burn area and also volumes. It's something complicated with pines and coppices and plus 20% and so it was nice. Exactly the same difficulty in my sense, but it's interesting. And so my question is not that it is about fire protection, defense against fire, because for me, forest defense against fire is a good policy in France and Europe. I'm not a specialist because it's more in the south of France. And is it included or not, or can it be included in the model because it costs a lot? And I think nowadays the question would be, will ONF or other forest agencies and the state and so on, will they invest a lot to have systems of defense in the north of France, for example, as we have now in the south, for example? Because I know, for example, in Landes, in Aquitaine, the system of defense is very different. It's based on silviculture, it's still based on forest owners themselves. In Mediterranean regions, it's completely different. And so I think a great issue for policy in the next century will be the next 50 years probably will be what will be the system in our part of France. And I think if FSM is able to share that.
So it's an issue that I'm still discovering, the fire issue, because I've been mostly working with it for only one and a half years.
It is not a criticism.
But
just a question.
About how to implement it in the model, I think we could do some things very I mean, some very general things. I've been thinking maybe I mean, it would require to have more discussion with the FCE at ONF, which I'm actually having, but not that much so far. But we could we could imagine something where from the burnt areas predicted by the model, we could assume that some prevention measures are effective and that we could decrease the predicted burned areas by the model in some areas, maybe not in the mountainous regions because they're not accessible. So we can imagine using several expert-based knowledge, rules of decisions, and GIS-based knowledge to try and simulate fires as if they were effectively combated by firefighting. But these are just ideas from the top of my mind. I haven't really been thinking finally about it. But yeah, could be done.
Do you know
but
if there is some research, for example, in Spain or in Italy, in Southern Europe about that?
I think there is. I think I saw there was a large European research project a few years ago. I don't remember the name of it, but you can find it. I can send it to you, and it was about prescribed burning and these kind of methods that you can use to protect the forest. So research does exist on those topics, and I almost have it. I have it on the tip of my tongue, but it was a big project about this kind of management, and I know also that for the label bas carbone, Olivier Glaise from CNPF told me that they're actually developing a fourth method. So there are three methods right now, and the fourth method will be about fire prevention. So I haven't seen it because it's not finished, but it could be used, I guess, as a means to use carbon finances to contribute to fire prevention in southern forests. So there are things being implemented.
Okay. And so my last question is about uncertainty. Okay, uncertainty is it's very interesting the way you begin to discuss with climate change community, climatologists, and modeler of risk modelers. But probably if at the same there is other source of uncertainty. For example, the volume at the beginning when you take a volume from National Forest Inventory, there is a lot of uncertainty. So is there any reason to put more emphasis of uncertainty coming from climate and climate-induced uncertainty on the risk and not other sources of uncertainties?
So I would say that this was a personal choice because when I was working on carbon sequestration, I read things about non-permanence and the risks of carbon being released. So because I had my background in environmental sciences and I was particularly interested in fires, so I think it was more of a personal choice, the fire topic. And then learning that fires were very stochastic and dependent on climate, then I got into this uncertainty analysis thing about fires. But you're true to say that it's one type of parameter, and in the end, it's just an uncertainty about tree mortality that is induced by climate. So there are many other types of uncertainties in the model. So some of them concern parametric data, so the data from the base year. So these are uncertain because there can be measurement problems in the forest, for instance, when they measure the trees. Then you can have uncertainty about model parameters, so elasticities and all other parameters that are used. And so that's another type of uncertainty. And actually, we have an idea in the modeling team to perform a systematic and comprehensive sensibility analysis about the model. So that's one of the next steps, to do something more encompassing. And finally, you have also uncertainty about socioeconomic developments in the society. And this is completely exogenous, it's largely exogenous in the model, and we could model different transition pathways for the forest sector, but this should probably go through scenario analysis. And there's actually some work being done on this. There are American researchers who are translating the SSP scenarios from IPCC into forestry SSP scenarios. So this is the kind of approach we could use to address this kind of socioeconomic scenario uncertainty.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Merci. Thank you very much. So let me try. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
No. Okay. So So let me, first of all, thank you very much again for for you, to Philippe and to Sylvain for the invitation. I'm very happy to see this PhD, and especially around a model that I've had the chance of working around or working on before. This work is really rich, as has been said before, and it can be read or discussed along several sort of entry points. The one I'm going to choose here with a few questions is around modeling. And I really like the fact that you've done two things in the same PhD. One is actually develop a model and use it and to try and obtain some policy relevant insights from. But also you had sort of your first two chapters sort of come back more to the method and to the history of the tool. So you take a distance from the tool itself, which is, I think, rare and really welcome. Modelers often tend to be a bit too close to their tool and not to take enough distance from it. So I really appreciate that. So I'll try. I've sent you I had a long list of questions, but in the interest of time, I think I'll try and limit myself to three around the structure of the model itself that you present. So it's more related to chapters 3 and 4, about the link between models and policy, so module chapters 1 and 2, and about the sort of the regional coverage of forest models finally. On the structure, and this question actually has been raised in the previous comments as well. There's something that I'm still a bit puzzled, is the fact that the model itself includes two different visions of the behavior of the same agent, which is the forest owner. As you said, there's the investment decision, which is controlled by the Forstmann-Hartmann optimization, and then you have the supply decisions, the equations where supply at your t over supply at your t minus 1 is a function of the evolution of prices, and that equation does not necessarily, or at least to my knowledge, cannot be derived directly from the Forstmann-Hartmann model. In fact, it's not fully compatible with it, even with the first order derivative of the Forstmann model. Meaning that you have, and it's more, a function that represents, tries to represents the observed behavior of suppliers, so supply and demand, and link them with relevant variables. So I'm wondering whether whether there's that's not an issue, or at least and whether there are developments here that could try and bring together or make more consistent, internally consistent, those two representations of the behavior of, again, the same agent, your forest owner. And that opens also, let me add one element to that question on the economic model, the representation of economics within the model, which is to ask whether there are other elements in the model, in the economic part of the model, that may also be at least controversial from an economic analysis perspective, and that may also be discussed. You talk a lot about the representation of the biology side, but it's unclear whether and you suggest that, as Valentin noted at the very end, whether even the economic part of the model, so for instance the trade part of the model, is something that is secure, or whether that also requires some developments.
Okay, thank you for the question. So regarding the first half of the question, so indeed in the French forest sector model, in the current version, we have these two different decisions. So one is the timber supply, and it's at the scale of the regional market, whereas the other one is the replanting decision, which is at the pixel scale, so the local scale, which is more of an individual owner's perspective. So the basic assumption behind this is that even though they may be the same people in the real world, in the model they're kind of different agents. One has short-term, well, one takes short-term supply decision based on current prices, whereas the other one takes longer-term decisions based on his or her expectations about the long-term future. And so that's the basic assumption behind the model. Whereas in the true world, it's the same people who make these decisions. The forest owner, they choose when they harvest, and they choose what they replant after the harvest. So I think the way I like to see it, the way it is represented, I like to see it not as different modules of the same model, which would need to be absolutely consistent, but rather as different models that communicate together. And in this way, I understand it may not be completely compatible, but in the same way as the fire activity model is not entirely compatible with the FFSM, and we had to make adjustments and to make compromise to make it work. So I think in a way it could be a necessary evil. But then to answer your question, I think, so that's a hypothesis because I wasn't here when this version of the model was developed, but I think this management module was created to tackle one of the key limitations of recursive forest sector models, which is that they usually consider forest management as exogenous, and as such they are not well suited for long-term analysis where the evolution of the resource and the evolution of management can change the markets over the long term. So even though it might not be perfect, I think it was created as a way to tackle this key limitation. And I think, as far as I know, it's almost the only recursive model that has really introduced forest management endogenously. One way to have something entirely consistent within a single model would be to develop one of the optimal control intertemporal optimization models, because from what I understand, everything is based on the same logic. And I reread a few days ago the early articles about the people who developed the first optimal control model of the global forest sector. And they show with all the analytical analysis of the model that under some conditions about like no land use, for instance, no changes in land use or other assumptions, you can find again the Faustman conditions from their market model. So I don't have everything in detail in my mind, but they showed that it was internally consistent in the way you just described. But that's not the type of model that we have. So I think if you wanted something that could tie back together the market equilibrium and the Faustman logic, you would need to develop again one of those optimal control models, like they did those researchers. And and regarding the second half of your question, so it's actually something we have in mind with the other colleagues here, especially regarding how trade is modeled in the French forest sector model. So there was a master thesis performed last year or 2 years ago about the assumptions behind the modeling of trade in the spatial equilibrium and comparing it to actual fluxes of trade and showing that it did not really match reality all that well. And so that's one of the direction that the team is taking. I'm not heavily involved in this so far, but there is a PhD that has actually started a few months ago that will look more into the details of this question. Probably more at an international level than the French level, but it's going on. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's clever to come back to the history of why this was why the Faustman management model was introduced in the first place. It does still, there's still, if you want to go further, there's probably still a question as to whether the choice, the representation of the decision on what to plant, to replant, and how whether Faustman itself is the right model, or whether something different or more might be put in, as also Marianne suggested right before. My second question is more on the link between policy and modeling. You told a story in chapter 1, which is very neat and quite convincing, which is, you have policymakers having questions, and then they talk to modelers, and they put their questions to modelers, and then modelers react. So it's basically a one-way relationship. Then modelers provide insights back to policymakers. But really, it's really a one-way drive. In my field, things are a bit more complicated. In particular, models or integrated assessment models of global climate change, for instance, tend to have a life on their own, and they do influence how policies frame their questions. And sometimes the questions are asked because the models can answer them. For instance, these models tend to look at very long time horizons, and question about the short-term action on climate mitigation have been more difficult, not even reason that much, because the modeling community was not able to respond. So there's a really, and I was wondering whether the forestry sector was here an exception, where indeed modelers were reacting correctly, or whether limitations in models also have some influence backward. Especially looking at your chapter 2, where you note that some questions about non-timber services are not dealt with.
Okay. So thank you for the question. So I think the issue you described, that some issues are treated only because models can treat them, and those that the models cannot treat are not really addressed, is really a quick question, which I highlighted in the end of the introduction, is that do we use models to address truly what's relevant or only what we can do? And I think the question is particularly relevant when policy advice relies only on one type of models, and that's a danger. But I think in the case of the forest sector models are only one tool, and as I said, you should always compare results to what you obtain with other methods. But I wouldn't say that they're the only tools used for providing policy advice. So if I take just the example that I know, what's being done here at the lab, the forest sector modeling team is not even half of the lab, and some other people investigate the same issues with other methods. So we have several people who are working with forest scale assessments about carbon storage and mitigation, or drought risk, and there are really the mirror of what I did, for instance, in my PhD, but at the sectoral scale. And when we talk together, we see that our modeling approaches are different, and they have different limitations, and they are complementary. So from the little things, from the limited things I have seen so far, I would say that policy in forestry doesn't rely that heavily on forest sector models and relies on different types of models. So I wouldn't expect the same kind of issue to arise as the one you mentioned, maybe for integrated assessment models, but I don't know that sector that well. So yeah, I would say that different methods, different scales are considered, and in this case, it's not so much of a problem because you have a variety of methods. And if I can go even further, yes, our models at the sectoral scale, they have limitations. One of their limitations is that they're deterministic and that they simplify environmental conditions, and that's why also I wanted to work on this issue and to bring something forward, and that's what inspired my last chapter about fires, because I thought, okay, so this is a limitation of the models. I'm going to try to bring something and study an event that is localized, depends on local conditions, and is uncertain, and that brought me towards the introduction of the probabilistic component. So yes, there are limitations, but I really try to overcome a bit of those limitations.
Okay. Maybe a third and last question I have is on again on chapter 1, on the landscape of forest modeling that it paints. because it seems to be a story that is entirely developed countries, and in fact, even narrower than that, just basically Europe and the US. There's nothing or barely anything coming from developed countries in Asia, and nothing at all from developing countries, even though there are many forest is obviously is obviously important in these countries. Forest management as well, at least in some of them. And it's again, it's a bit at odds with what I can see from other areas where, for instance, again in climate change, climate mitigation, you see now an emergence quite strong of modeling tools, modeling teams, modeling capacities, at least in intermediate countries, and even in some of the lower income ones. So, is that a correct assessment? And if so, what would you? I mean, how would you explain it?
So thank you for the question. So indeed, from what I've seen in my different reviews, most of the forest sector models are still developed in Europe and in North America. So not only the US, but there are also examples in Canada that are more recent, but it still remains North America. I also saw some example from Japan with some older articles from Japan. But yes, indeed, there are few examples for the rest of the world. I would say it's because a first factor could be the weight of history. So models used today are still being developed close to the places the original models were developed. And also maybe the field of forest sector modeling remains quite small compared to integrated assessment models, for instance. So that could be another explanation, maybe, that the field is too small to really incentivize other institutions, maybe in other countries, to invest in these methodologies. But then the issue of tropical areas, they are dealt with, but they are dealt with usually with global models and by researchers based maybe in the US or in Europe, but with global models. And another hypothesis I have is that the question of tropical areas is closely linked with land use changes, land use dynamics, and deforestation, for instance. And these issues may be treated with agricultural land use models or coupled models of the forest and agriculture sectors, and not so much with pure forest sector models as we define them. So that might be another explanation. I don't have a definite explanation, but yes, indeed, your assessment, I would say, is largely correct, that most models are developed in northern countries, but those of them that are global models are also used to investigate issues related to other regions in the world.
Okay, thanks. I take the point on the fact that the questions might be different, and in particular, land use and land use change models might be more appropriate, at least in some cases, not all of them. However, it still remains a mystery, because there are also forest plantations, there are also forest management questions per se. It might actually be an interesting area of development for the beta Nancy to look into this. Well, with this, thank you very much, and I'll now give the floor to your two co-supervisors. I don't know who is first, Sylvain or Philippe.
Merci Franck. Moi, je vais me permettre de parler en français, vu que les mots du directeur de thèse, en général, c'est un petit peu plus personnel. Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier Sylvain. C'est la deuxième thèse qu'on co-dirige ensemble et qui se termine ces derniers mois. Bon, dans chacune de ces deux thèses qui tournent un petit peu autour de FFSM, c'est plus toi le leader et qui gère une grosse partie de la direction. En tout cas, c'est toujours un réel plaisir de travailler dans ces conditions-là et avec toi. Merci aussi au jury pour avoir accepté de lire et de commenter la thèse de Miguel. Merci en particulier à Franck, quand même, puisque c'est lui qui est l'initiateur de FFSM il y a environ 13 ans maintenant, et qui a travaillé avec nous pendant de nombreuses années, donc ça fait très plaisir. Je pense que c'est pareil pour Sylvain que Franck soit dans ce jury, qui est un petit peu le grand-père académique de Miguel finalement. Ça te donne un coup de vieux, je suis désolé. Donc voilà, encore merci à toi et merci à vous tous. Donc, Miguel, mon cher Miguel, en tant que directeur de thèse, tu te doutes que je vais pas t'apesantir de trop de questions sur ta thèse. Tu as très bien répondu de manière très claire et très complète tout au long de cet après-midi. Donc tu as mérité de te reposer un petit peu, et puis donc je vais pas trop en rajouter. J'aurais juste une toute petite question. Il y a un petit point quand même qui me taraude et sur lequel j'aimerais bien un petit éclaircissement. Donc depuis qu'on se côtoie, à la fois professionnellement et puis un petit peu personnellement également, j'ai été témoin d'un certain nombre de tes qualités. Elles sont nombreuses. Professionnellement, tout d'abord, je pense que tout le monde a pu voir aujourd'hui à la fois une très grande rigueur dans ce que tu fais, une rigueur même très impressionnante, une méticulosité. On sent que tu laisses pas les choses au hasard, tu couvres chaque détail de manière très claire et très approfondie. Je ne suis pas quelqu'un moi-même de très méticuleux, mais Sylvain l'est beaucoup plus que moi. Je pense que même lui a été impressionné par cette qualité-là. Mais ce qui fait ta force, c'est que cette rigueur, cette méticulosité, tu la mets au service d'une force de proposition permanente. Tu as beaucoup d'idées, tu les fais vivre. Et puis, tu n'as pas hésité aussi à nous solliciter de manière assez récurrente pour beaucoup de manières, Sylvain et moi. On a parfois l'impression que c'est plus pour te rassurer que pour demander notre validation, pour te conseiller. Mais on a été ravis de le faire en tout cas, et on espère qu'on l'a fait de la manière la plus efficace possible. Donc au total, j'ai souvent été vraiment impressionné par ton travail. Quand on recevait tes travaux et qu'on devait les lire et les commenter, je me sentais souvent un petit peu démuni dans le sens où j'avais parfois le sentiment d'avoir pas grand chose d'autre à dire que ouais, c'est bien, c'est très bien, donc bravo. Et quand j'avais des conseils ou des suggestions, tu avais aussi cette capacité de te les approprier et puis de les mettre en œuvre vraiment avec une très grande efficacité. Donc au total, te voilà avec une thèse et des travaux de qualité que je trouve vraiment remarquables. Tu t'es approprié ton sujet en profondeur, on a parlé avec ces sujets, avec ces deux chapitres un petit peu plus historiques, on va dire. Tu es entré dans un modèle qui était déjà existant depuis une dizaine d'années, donc c'est jamais facile, il y a des gens qui sont passés avant toi, il faut rentrer dans le code, il faut vraiment se mettre dedans, ça aussi tu l'as fait. En plus de ça, tu as contribué de manière vraiment importante à faire avancer ce modèle. Et puis en plus de ça, je trouve tu as une forme de réflexivité par rapport à ton activité, tu l'as bien montré sur la question sur le feu par exemple. En gros, tu vas travailler sur l'introduction du feu dans FFSL, mais tu vas pas juste ça, tu le fais parce que tu as noté qu'une des faiblesses de ces modèles forestiers, c'était des modèles déterministes, et donc tu te donnais par là même une option pour mettre un petit peu de complexité et pour repousser certaines frontières de ces modèles. Donc pour tout ça, franchement, je trouve que tu peux vraiment être fier de toi. Tu vois, avec une thèse et des travaux de qualité vraiment remarquables, donc bravo. Et puis, bon, personnellement aussi, j'ai pu noter un certain nombre de tes caractéristiques. J'ai pu noter ton amour immodéré pour les pizzas, la Suède, les coffee shops. Je parle pas de tes penchants pour les jeux de société parce que ça reste dans certaines mesures un mystère pour moi. Et donc, à la vue de tous ces éléments, en particulier de cette rigueur et de cette méticulosité que j'ai évoquée, il me reste donc une question que j'ai pour toi et pour laquelle j'aimerais ton éclairage, une forme d'incompréhension de ma part, c'est pourquoi après toutes ces années, malgré des sollicitations vraiment nombreuses je pense, pourquoi est-ce que j'ai jamais réussi à récupérer ce DVD des chansons d'amour que je t'avais prêté?
Parce que je ne l'ai pas encore regardé, mais je sais où il est. Je le ramènerai.
Bravo encore.
Merci.
Bon, je prends la parole aussi en français. Bon, moi, j'ai rien préparé, donc c'est du live. Je pense que Philippe a déjà tout dit, mais je vais déjà aussi remercier Philippe et puis l'ensemble de l'équipe du Bêta avec qui on a travaillé. Moi, je veux aussi remercier Franck, qu'on ne voit plus, mais qui doit être là, j'espère. Ils sont toujours là. Oui, oui, c'est bon, ils sont là. Et effectivement, ça me fait très plaisir d'être là déjà à cette place et d'être donc avec c'est mon fils académique et mon père académique. C'est un peu bizarre comme situation, mais voilà, c'est une situation assez agréable à vivre. Moi, je voudrais revenir sur un petit peu la genèse de la thèse et puis comment finalement tu es passé d'un pré-thésard à un vrai docteur, en fait. Et je sais pas si tu te souviens, mais au début, tu te sentais pas légitime. Tu me disais tout le temps, mais moi, j'arriverai jamais à monter un projet de recherche, à le faire vivre. Et en fait, aujourd'hui, tu nous as vraiment démontré le contraire, pour plusieurs raisons. Alors déjà parce que, bon, effectivement, et je pense que tout le monde l'a noté, était extrêmement rigoureux. À la fois sur la forme, c'est vrai, hein, ton manuscrit il est parfait, mais aussi sur le fond. C'est-à-dire que quand tu comprends pas quelque chose, tu vas au bout de la réflexion, tu vas au bout tu vas décortiquer vraiment le problème pour vraiment comprendre pourquoi tu comprends pas. Et je pense que ça, c'est une qualité qui est propre aux chercheurs, donc que tu ne pensais peut-être pas avoir au début, mais que tu as vraiment en toi. Donc pour moi, tu es un vrai chercheur aussi grâce à ça. Et surtout, quelque chose que peut-être tu n'avais pas au début, mais que tu as acquis en cours de route, c'est l'envie d'aller voir ailleurs, en fait, et l'envie de voler, en fait, de tes propres ailes, et tu l'as démontré dans le chapitre 4. Tu es sorti de l'équipe FFSM, tu es allé monter une collaboration avec des gens qu'on ne connaissait pas, enfin, en tout cas que l'équipe FFSM ne connaissait pas, et voilà, tu as saisi une opportunité, tu as su la créer, tu as su la faire vivre, et en ça aussi, c'est un vrai travail de recherche. Voilà. Tu es allé, à partir de ta curiosité, de tes envies, tu allais monter une vraie collaboration. Et tout ça dans la thèse. Enfin, je veux dire, c'est pas un travail post-thèse, c'est vraiment un travail dans la thèse. Donc pour moi, ça c'est vraiment remarquable. Il faut quand même le souligner parce que c'est pas tous les thésards qui arrivent à faire ça. Et je pense que voilà, c'est quelque chose pour lequel il faut te féliciter. Donc bravo, bravo pour tout le travail que tu as fait. Bravo pour tout le travail qui est en cours aussi, qui est en cours de publication. Et puis on a hâte de continuer pardon. On a hâte de continuer à travailler avec toi. Pardon?
Non, vas-y, continue.
On a hâte de continuer à travailler avec toi et avec du coup le CIRED, puisqu'aujourd'hui tu fais le pont entre Nancy et le Bêta, et puis Nogent-sur-Marne et le CIRED.
Je voulais juste mentionner aussi Antonello qui a eu un rôle important dans
Oui, merci Antonello pour tout.
Qui est derrière la caméra.
Le réalisateur.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Alors je vous propose que maintenant on se retrouve pour délibérer. Ce sera un petit peu virtuel, mais je crois que je demande aux membres de l'audience de sortir, de telle sorte que, et aux candidats de sortir, de telle sorte que le jury puisse délibérer. On peut, pour tous les autres membres du jury, on peut rallumer les caméras s'il vous plaît. Ok. Alors, normalement, le jury se lève aussi, mais là, par vidéoconférence, ce sera un petit peu compliqué. Merci Valentin. Donc, Monsieur Miguel Rivière, donc, après avoir délibéré, le jury est heureux de vous décerner le grade de docteur de l'Institut agronomique, vétérinaire et forestier de France, spécialité sciences économiques, pour votre travail donc, sur l'analyse prospective du secteur forestier. Donc, il n'y a plus de mention qui est donnée, il n'y a plus de mention à ce grade. Mais je peux dire qu'au nom de l'ensemble du jury, que l'on a particulièrement apprécié la qualité de votre présentation, ainsi que la qualité de votre réponse, de vos réponses aux questions. Ça a été souligné, le membre du jury disant même que c'est la première fois qu'il avait des réponses aussi détaillées, fouillées et élaborées à ces questions. On a apprécié la clarté de ces réponses, Ça a été souligné à plusieurs reprises. On a apprécié aussi votre honnêteté dans les réponses et votre capacité à dire que vous ne savez pas. Et je pense parler au nom de tous les membres du jury, il faut dire que c'est une qualité vraiment importante à ne pas perdre. Que des fois, certains collègues ont trop tendance à perdre justement lorsqu'ils s'expriment. Et puis finalement, on a apprécié les qualités humaines dont vous avez, les qualités de chercheur que vous avez laissé transparaître dans cette présentation. Donc un grand bravo et toutes nos félicitations pour ce titre et ce grade amplement mérité. Bravo.
Merci à vous.
Docteur Miguel Rivière.
Faut que je fasse un discours Ah oui, je peux faire un petit discours. Voilà. Avant qu'on se quitte, je voudrais remercier le jury qui a discuté mon travail avec moi. Merci beaucoup. Mes encadrants, donc Sylvain et Philippe, qui m'ont accueilli au laboratoire quand j'étais encore petit enfant, et qui sont devenus mes amis aussi au fil des années, et ça c'est vraiment précieux. Merci aussi Antonello, qui est caché derrière la caméra, mais qui était un peu mon troisième encadrant, toujours dans l'ombre. Merci aussi à mes collaborateurs à Avignon. Je ne sais pas s'ils sont encore en ligne, mais en tout cas, merci beaucoup pour tout ce que vous m'avez appris sur les feux de forêt. Et merci à ma famille. Et merci à tous mes amis aussi. Voilà, tous mes amis qui sont certains ici dans la salle, certains en ligne. Voilà. Merci beaucoup à tous. Et, je me souviendrai longtemps de ces 3 années de thèse. Et j'espère que ça va continuer. Pas la thèse, mais la recherche. La recherche. Et les bons temps entre amis. Voilà. Merci beaucoup à tous pour tous ces moments passés ensemble. Je ne les oublierai pas.
Merci. Et puis donc bon pot dans le respect des règles sanitaires.
Il y avait combien de gens connectés?
30.
Et puis merci à tous les membres du jury, auxquels je demanderai simplement de m'envoyer une petite note très rapide, hein, il n'y a pas besoin de faire très long, mais simplement de la façon dont vous résumez les questions-réponses pour votre partie, et je mettrai ça ensemble et je ferai circuler ensuite.
Okay.
You can send me a very quick note with your question about your Q&A session, and then I'll put all this together and circulate it around.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you very much. Merci
beaucoup.
beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you.
Au revoir.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
On se déconnecte du coup.
Ouais, on peut se déconnecter.